I have been walking down the same road for 3 years, 4 months, and 9 days. At least that's what my phone tells me. Time works a lot differently here than it should. I guess you're probably confused as to what I'm even talking about, aren't you? I should probably start from the beginning to show you the current predicament I'm in. On May 16th, 2014, which seemed like an average day at the time, I began to walk home from school with my little brother. Our high school was within walking distance of our house, so our parents saw no reason why they should drive us when the weather was nice, as it was on this day. Our house was a rather small one in a large neighborhood, but our neighbors were all very nice people. "So, what are you planning on doing for Mom's birthday?" Max, my little brother, asked me, breaking the silence between us. "No idea. Dad probably has a few ideas, but he hasn't told me anything yet," I replied to him. "Well, he better hurry up. It's tomorrow, after all," he said. I chuckled. It sounded weird for Max to be worrying about something like this. "Don't worry. He always has a knack for surprises. I'm sure he'll pull something off," I said with another chuckle. I didn't hear a reply, and after an extended period of silence, I turned to face Max. "Don't you—" I was cut short when I noticed I was suddenly alone. "Max?" I called out and heard nothing in response. "Max!" I called out again, but still no reply came. "Fine, then I'll just leave you here," I screamed out down the neighborhood. It wasn't unusual for him to bail and try and scare me whenever we walked home. Don't ask me why he does it, but I found it weird how he had gotten away without me hearing him. I continued walking down the side of the road, as there were no sidewalks. But I was surprised after walking on for a while longer, and not hearing Max running up behind me. "Oh well, I guess he's walking on his own," I said as I continued to walk. I began to pass my friend David's house. David was a friend I'd met back in middle school, but we hadn't talked in quite a while. My house was at the end of the street, right at the roundabout to turn back around and head back to the main road. I looked ahead again and pulled out my phone. I tried to open Instagram, but to my surprise, I had no reception. Weird. We've never struggled with bad reception in this part of the neighborhood. I kept closing and reopening Instagram, waiting for the signal to get better. I began to pass by my friend David's house. Wait, I stopped dead in my tracks, and I looked up at the same house I'd passed just minutes earlier. I looked across the street towards the neighbor's house, and the familiar sight we'd see when we played in his front yard was still before me. I must have passed by similar-looking houses and mistook it for David's. That's probably what's happening. I continued walking. This time, I put my phone away to watch the streets, and as I walked a bit further, I saw the same red house come into view. I stood in front of Daniel's house, dumbfounded, and I looked back across the street again, where the neighbor's house across the street was. This was impossible. What was going on? I continued walking again, and the same 5 houses on my left and right side continued to appear before me over and over again. I pulled my phone from my pocket again, but still I had no signal. I tried calling the police, but was met with nothing, not even a dial tone. I then tried calling any number I could in my phone, but still nothing went through. I began to panic. I had no idea what was going on or what to do. I then noticed something from the corner of my eye. A massive wall of black nothingness that was coming my direction. Not the smartest idea, but I turned around to walk towards it. When I reached it, I noticed that it was continuing to move at a snail's pace. I reached out to touch the wall, and quickly pulled my hand away as soon as I made contact with it. Nothing happened. I had expected to pull my hand away and have it not be there anymore, or something like that. I stuck my arm inside the wall, and it completely disappeared in the darkness on the other side. I left it in there for a few seconds, and then pulled it back, and my arm looked just as it did before I stuck it into the wall. I turned around and stared at the infinitely continuing line of the same 5 houses, and thought that this wall might have been a way out of this place. So I took a deep breath, and I stepped into the darkness. As I'd expected, I saw nothing as soon as I entered, only an endless dark. I turned, and I could still see the neighborhood on the other side of the wall, but there was no light entering in from the other side. I took a few steps forward, and I felt like I was walking on a completely different surface than I'd have before. I'd never experienced walking on nothing, and this is what I imagined it felt like. I took a few more steps forward, but a sudden light in front of me forced me to come to a halt. 2 specks of what appeared to be fire appeared in front of me. But what's weird was that they looked like eyes. A shiver went down my spine, and I got the feeling nothing but bad things would happen if I stuck around here. I decided I didn't want to find out if this was an exit right now, and began to slowly back away, back towards the entrance. Instantly, massive shapes of flame appeared from where I saw the eyes, which looked like wings. Next thing I knew, I could hear the sound of metal hitting metal ringing in my ears, and I watched as the flames began to come closer to me. My eyes widened in horror, and I turned on my heels, and I sprinted back towards my neighborhood. Sprinting back felt like it was way longer than it should have been. All the while, the footsteps behind me were getting louder as whatever that thing was continued to get closer to me. It reached the point where it sounded like they were only a few feet behind me, and I dove out of the wall of darkness and onto the pavement. My elbows were scratched to ruins, and when I looked to face the wall, I saw a blue, gauntleted arm reaching out for me through the wall. It looked like a medieval knight in armor, but it looked more like thick ice than it did metal. I could see the flames through the wall, but aside from the arm, I couldn't see what the rest of the knight looked like. It pulled its arm back behind the wall and stood at the edge of the darkness, staring at me with eyes that I couldn't read. I got to my feet and backed away from the wall. The knight didn't follow, just continued to stand at the edge of the wall. I guess it couldn't walk beyond that. I decided that I'd take my chances with the neighborhood, then whatever the hell that thing was. I continued to walk down the neighborhood, and as usual, the same 5 houses on both sides of the street continued to appear. I guess I was the only one in this strange world after all, judging from the fact that I hadn't seen a single sign of life for a while. And I hadn't noticed it before. After all, only 15 minutes had passed, but the sun began to set on the horizon, and I saw the streetlights activate just as they would, like normal at this time of day. I passed David's house again, and noticed that the lights came on as soon as I passed by, and I saw a shadow passing by the window. My blood began to rush, and I ran towards the house, desperate to find someone, anyone. As I reached the front door, I looked inside the translucent glass they had on it, and could see shadows moving on the inside of the house. There were other people living inside. I rang the doorbell. Even if it wasn't the same family, I don't think I'd care, as long as it was just somebody. I saw a shadow walk towards the door, and I could hear it unlocking it, and when the door opened, I was met by something that was far from what I was expecting to see. It was far from human, and even calling it humanoid in shape would be a stretch. It was a creature, but it lacked any facial features. and massive lumps of flesh and bone were scattered around its body like tumors. The creature also stunk of decaying flesh, and I looked up to the face of the monstrosity. I froze, but the creature made no move to grab me or hurt me in any way. It just stared, and I began to back away from the door and turned to walk back towards the road. The creature stepped out onto the porch and watched me as I walked away. Then it turned and walked back inside its house. I stopped in the center of the road and turned to look at all the houses. The lights were on in all of them, and I could see shadows moving in every single one of them. Those things lived in every single house. What the hell were they anyways? I noticed the black barrier approaching me once again, and I could see that night continuing to stand at the edge of it. I began walking forwards once again, unknowing of what to do. What the hell is this place? I asked no one in particular. What felt like 30 minutes later, I saw the sun begin to rise over the horizon. I guess time worked differently here as well. I saw those creatures begin to walk out of their homes, but they didn't pay much attention to me. They just acted like they were regular human beings. They were doing yard work, and the little ones would run around and play like they were children, and I could see some of them relaxing on their porches. It's like they really were living in a strange world, this endlessly looping world. I continued to walk for what felt like days, the sun rising and setting faster than it should have. I noticed the more and more I passed by the houses, the more I noticed how much they were deteriorating. The creatures that lived in them also appeared to be getting more and more unhappy as time went on. Every now and then, I would catch where their faces should have been looking in my direction. It's like I was somehow to blame for all of this happening. All the while I walked, that black wall continued to get closer and closer, like it was speeding up as time went along. Every time I looked back, I could see that fiery night looming just on the edge of the barrier. But as time went on, more and more of those nights began to appear alongside the first one. I've been walking for what should have been months at this point. I pulled my phone from my pocket. In this world, I didn't starve, tire, or dehydrate, and my phone's battery never went down either for some strange reason. It was my only source of entertainment, and more likely, the only thing that was allowing me to hold on to what's left of my sanity. All I had in this world was that and nothing else after all. When I wasn't on my phone, I was walking. I was always walking, seeing the same pattern of houses on both sides of the street, over and over and over again. I'd sometimes catch myself saying the colors of the houses whenever I'd pass them by, but it soon turned into every time, right side blue, red, gray, gray, blue, left side, yellow, yellow, blue, white, yellow. Every time. It was the same thing every damn time. Another pass by. Right side blue, red, gray, gray, blue. Left side, yellow, yellow, blue, white, yellow. It never changes. It never fucking changes. I sometimes catch myself ripping at my arms, relishing in the feeling of pain, which was the one last thing I could feel in this infinite world. Each time I passed by the houses, they continued to deteriorate more and more. Some of them to the point where they weren't even livable anymore. And the creatures that lived in those homes no longer pretended that they're human. They just stand at the edge of the street and stare at me as I pass by. And the more and more I pass by, the more the homes begin to turn into piles of rubble. Now every time I pass by, all I'm met with is the faceless monstrosities that watch me as I walk by. Every part of my body probably scarred by my fingernails at this point. The scratching had become an addiction. The pain allowed me to remember that I'm still alive, that somehow, throughout all of this, I've continued to hold on to my humanity. The barrier began to get faster at a much quicker pace. At this point, it was matching my walking speed, so I had to continue to move faster to outpace it. Any sanity I used to have was gone now. The faceless figures made sure of that. I would continue to pass by them over and over, and they'd just stare at me, like I was the one responsible for their homes being destroyed. On one pass by, I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my head, and when I grabbed at the wound, I saw blood rushing from it. I looked up at the kid who threw the rock. He just continued to stand and stare, like they always did. I finally broke. I picked up the rock and chucked it as hard as I could at the child. The rock connected with its deformed head, and it grabbed at it like it was in pain. I fell to my knees and began screaming at the creatures that continued to stare at me with contempt. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. I never asked to be here. I didn't destroy your homes. Stop it. Just stop staring at me like that. I could feel the tears begin to stream down my cheeks. I just want to go home. Is that too much to ask? I curled up into the fetal position and continued to sob loudly. It was the only display of humanity I'd performed in a long time. I could see movement through my teary eyes and noticed them beginning to move. When I looked up, I saw them walking towards the wall. I didn't notice just how close the wall had gotten, and I got to my feet and prepared to run. But I noticed the way the creatures were slowly walking towards the wall, like they were finally surrendering to the fate they knew would come one day. I didn't have time to be remorseful. I sprinted down the neighborhood, all the while listening to the sounds of flesh being ground into whatever those creatures were eating. Then, there was nothing. The rubble from the homes had been pulled back into the earth, more and more whenever I passed by the decrepit neighborhood. The wall seemed very far behind me, but that was the only relief I was currently feeling. With the creatures gone, true isolation was all I could feel. With them staring at me, at least there was something for me to interact with, even if we never said words to each other. But with there being nothing at all anymore, well, it didn't help my sanity one bit. I knew deep down that long ago I had completely broken, but I refused to come to terms with that as long as I could still walk upright. Suddenly a house came into my view, and my first thought was that the cycle was going to start all over again. But it was a house I didn't recognize. I'd completely memorized the houses I was caught in the loop with, but I didn't recognize this one. I began sprinting. I could see them. Unfamiliar homes scattered all around. I continued on, and eventually I came across a roundabout, and I could see my house at the end of it. I began walking forwards. Was this it? Was I finally going to be free from this hell? But I stopped in my tracks when I saw what was approaching. The black barrier was now approaching from my house. I turned around, but it was still approaching from behind me as well. I looked around. It was coming from everywhere. It was going to completely box me in. The fiery eyes of those knights inside began to increase in intensity as their anticipation grew. There was nowhere for me to go, and they were everywhere. There was not a single place where I could escape to. The barrier increased in speed, and I fell to my knees, waiting for the fate I should have been expecting to befall upon me. Every second it got closer, I saw the wings of flame extend from the backs of the monsters as they got even closer, and I closed my eyes when they got within arm's distance of me. But there was nothing. I opened my eyes. These knights were all reaching their icy arms toward me in an attempt to grab me, but but they were just out of reach. I looked down and noticed the barrier had stopped just a few feet away from me. The knights continued to swipe at me, and all I could do was sit there confused. Why would the barrier stop? Suddenly, I felt a buzz in my pocket, and my whole body froze at the sensation. I reached into my pocket and saw thousands of notifications appear on my home screen. Missed calls, text messages, emails, you name it, and it was probably there. I suddenly came to the realization, somehow, signal had gotten through, and I opened my phone and attempted to call the police once again. I dialed 911, and my anticipation for the sound of the phone ringing was almost too much to bear. But it never came. Any signal I had only appeared for an instant, and my hopes were immediately crushed at this discovery. I looked through my notifications, all of them being from friends asking me to come back home, or asking me where I went. But what broke me the most was all the missed calls I'd received from my mother. There were thousands of them. She called me every day since I've disappeared, and here I've been, walking along completely unaware of that. I opened my voicemail. In that brief second of signal, I managed to receive every voicemail into my inbox. And the most recent one was from my mother. And when I checked the date, my tears began streaming once again. I clicked on the voicemail, and the sound of her voice completely blocked out the noises of the monsters around me. Hi, Ben. I know it's been a while since you disappeared, but I know you're still out there somewhere. I don't know if you're receiving my calls, but as long as it keeps going through, then I won't stop calling. But anyways, I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday. I've been waiting for the day for you to come back, where we could celebrate all the ones you've missed. But Her voice cut out, and sob-filled words were all I could hear from the rest of the message. I miss you. I miss you so much. I don't know when you'll come home, but please, try not to make me wait too long. I love you, Ben, and I'll call you again tomorrow. Goodbye. Her sobs were the last thing I heard before she hung up, and I began sobbing all the more. I began to scream at the heavens, damning whatever God there was to allow me and my family to suffer such a fate. Ever since that moment, I've been writing this post. In the time it's taken me to write it, the barrier still hasn't moved. The knights continue to reach out and try to grab me, and I'm sure at some point, I'll throw myself at them and accept whatever fate this cruel world has in store for me. I'll post the story. It'll go to pending, so if I ever receive signal again, then it'll go through. But I don't know if I'll be alive at that point, or if the story ever even gets posted at all. My life ended the moment I entered this strange world, so at the very least, I can show how I spent my last days to the world. I wish to leave some kind of warning, but I still have no idea how I got here in the first place. So I guess I can leave you with this. The phrase, treat every day like it's your last. Listen to it. I know I should have. Goodbye, everyone. I doubt you'll ever hear from me again.